Today's discussion, flight numbers. What are they and why? That's the bigger part. Flight numbers are the numbers left to right on this disc. This is an NV, 3, 3, -1, 2. Truth, 5, 5, 0, 2. A lot of times 0, 1. And a katana, 13, 5, -3. We're going to discuss these. We're going to talk about how you can at least use these as a baseline, as a beginner player, or you've been playing for a short amount of time and maybe these numbers aren't making any sense to you. After this time, or after this video, you'll figure it out. Let's go to it. But if I complain long enough, they'll show up with concrete.
I apologize for this. I don't generally design courses where you're rewarded for garbage shots.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Kids on the Fairway. Today we are going to discuss flight numbers. Flight numbers are these numbers that are on the disc. Those 4 numbers on a NV. Maybe I went over it before. They're those same numbers left to right. And that decide what discs do. These numbers were put on discs, well, they were put on Innova discs specifically in around 2009. And it's a baseline. It is a scientific way of saying what this disc should do if I throw it at its, design speed and throwing it flat. So let's talk about those ratings. Those ratings are from left to right: speed, glide, turn, and fade. Another description of those, which I actually prefer when I'm talking to players that haven't been playing a long time, is speed, glide, high stability, and low stability. High speed stability, low speed stability. That's the HSS, LSS, because there was a time when that was used. And the particular reason that I like to explain that to the younger players, beginner players, intermediate players, whatever it may be, anybody that just wants to understand the numbers, is that if I tell somebody that it's speed, glide, turn, and fade, then people think turn means it's turning. And in general, yeah, I guess. If it's a negative number, it's turning the opposite way. But it's much easier to tell somebody what a disc is doing in its flight at its highest speed, and then what it does when it turns the next direction at its lowest speed. I won't use those terms, but in general, that's what I like to use because I feel it's a little bit easier to explain. So if you just understand that turn is what it's doing at its highest speed, fade is what it's doing at its lowest speed, that's what we'll continue with. So, what do those definitions mean? Speed actually is the definition originally for speed, and really still is, but people don't use it that way, was the width of a disc. A high-speed driver, a 13-speed katana, you look at this rim, it's pretty wide. You look at a Nuke SS, and I have a hard time holding on to it. It seems so wide. But that's what defined the speed, because the idea was that the wider the rim, the faster that it moves. But for players today, that speed number really refers to the speed you're throwing it. There is not a definition in miles per hour. It's basically, this is the way I think of it. If you take a 7-speed disc and you're a beginner player, if it's a neutral disc, which means it's supposed to just go straight. If you start throwing that flat and it always dumps, if you're a right-handed player, it always dumps left like fairly, quickly, then that means you're not throwing it at 7 speed. It means you're throwing it slower than that. And that's the important part about understanding speed. And we'll get into more about that later. But anyway, that's speed. Glide is how much air gets underneath this disc. This is really important. It's not important in reference to why that means glide. It's important to how discs fly, and that's a different video, and we can talk about that. I have talked about that in a wind training video, but we'll probably go into another video where we really talk about nothing about what's under, nothing else but what goes on underneath the disc. But that's how glide's generated. If I take this disc, it doesn't have a lot. Like you look at my finger there, it's barely 3/8 tall. So there's not a lot of circumference or a lot of capacity or just air space underneath this disc. But if I take a truth, it's tall, it's a fairly large disc, and it gets a lot of airspace. So that's what glide's about. The other number is probably really the most important as a beginner player or an intermediate player, and that's the turn number. The turn number defines your stability if you do everything else right. I throw it at this speed, it has a certain amount of glide. If I have a negative number, so if I take a katana that has 13.5, -3.3, that -3, that third number, my turn, is going to decide its stability. Because it's a negative number, it means it's understable. What does understable mean? You got an understable friend, you know exactly what it means. It means that that person that you know that's understable just can't handle things, can't handle life, can't handle whatever the situation is. That is exactly what understability refers to in a disc. It cannot handle your throw. It is meant to basically not handle it. So if I'm a right-hand player and I throw a katana flat, it is going to go to my right in its high speed. So as soon as it comes out of my hand and I've thrown it at this 13 speed, it's gonna start going right. And when it slows down, that's when it comes back. So if I have a 3, a +3, that's actually that's a fairly high number for a fade. We also call it the dump. You hear people talk about, wow, that disc really dumped. Yeah, because it had a really high fade number. So if you're a beginner player, you want to look for understable discs. And what I tell people to do when they're beginning is throw the understable discs. Don't throw these high-speed ones. Throw 7 speeds, maybe 8s, 9s, something like that. Throw leopards and T-birds and eagles. I'm sorry, I'm referring to a bunch of Innova discs. That's just what I grew up with. If I knew Discraft ones or MVP or something, I would do the same. Maybe I'll post them all at the end of the video. Anyway, that stability, that's what that number is. So if I have a stability of 1 or 2, that means even if I throw it at its actual speed, let's say I throw a disc that's a 12.5, 1, 3. It's gonna be turning, as a right-handed player, it's gonna be turning left right away. So you're probably gonna have to force it over if you want some type of a flex line. So anyway, that third number, that's your stability. Your last number, and I covered it a little bit already, is your fade. What's it gonna do when it slows down? The higher number, it's gonna dump. The lower number, or if you get a disc that has a 0, basically by the time it comes out of its high speed, it's pretty much just gonna fall to the ground. It's not really gonna go left or right. Those discs are actually hard to find. Well, they're harder, I would say they're harder for the higher speed drivers. I can get an eagle personally to go pretty much straight the whole time and really hardly go left or right, but mine's beat in. So that's what those numbers mean. Why are those numbers so important to the beginner players? Because if you're throwing with your friends and you're just throwing the discs that they have, and you're like, okay, well, my buddy's really good, I'm gonna throw what he has, it's really hard to understand why you can't do the same thing. And because there's so many things involved in throwing the disc flat or straight, or the right angles or the right speed and all those things, that's what this baseline is created for. So those are those numbers. I'm going to take a second, and I'm going to take a break. And when I come back, we're going to go over all the reasons why this affects you as a beginner player, and how you can understand and make the corrections and make these numbers at least a really good baseline, so that as you see improvement in your game and you get better, you're understanding why your discs are changing. We'll come right back. All right, why is it so important? It's three things. It's a baseline. It's a scientific number. Just gives you a good idea. It helps you fill gaps in the bag, or it's again a baseline to help you fill gaps in the bag. You have a high-speed driver that you like the shape of. You can kind of come down to a fairway driver, maybe look at the same numbers, and you can at least start with that. And then the last thing is that it's decent as a cross-reference. If you have been throwing a almost solo company bag, you're throwing all Innova, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I've got a lot of people throw Envies. That's kind of what happened to me. I can look at those numbers and I can say, oh, okay, and I can compare it to an AVR and Innova, whatever. It's a cross-reference. That's why the numbers are important. But here's where the numbers, here's the kind of the common mistakes. I would say the biggest common mistake is that a person will take like a destroyer, and that's 12, 5, -1, 2 or 3 or something, and they'll compare it to another disc that's shorter, or sorry, that it's more of a fairway driver, like an Eagle. The Eagle's a 7-speed, and the rest of those numbers, actually, let me see, because I think I kind of remember 7.4, -1.3. They're not exact, but they're close, and people aren't going to look for exact numbers, they're going to look for close. And realistically, they are fairly close. But what a lot of beginner players do when they pay too much attention to the flight numbers and don't use it for its really generality is that they throw a Eagle because they're a beginner player and they have really good control over a 7-speed disc, and they're throwing it flat and they're like, wow, I love what that disc does. It turns for me a little bit, has a slow fade, whatever. And then they go, well, what is that in a high-speed disc? And then they grab a destroyer. Mostly because, you know, it's one of the most popular discs that has ever been out. And the reason that doesn't work is because the one thing that beginning players don't think about is the fact that they're not consistent. They're rarely consistent, as a matter of fact. I've yet to ever meet a beginner player. I've yet to meet a player that's probably been maybe 3-4 years into the sport that really can control a flat disc or consistently choose the right nose angles for throwing. And that matters. And especially if you can't throw the speed. So you go and you buy a destroyer and you throw it just like you throw your Eagle, and the thing just dumps out as hard as it can right away, and you're like, oh my God, wow, that doesn't make any sense. Those numbers aren't right. That destroyer says it's a -1, and we just got done saying that means it's understable, and that's really close to the Eagle, and I see it flip. So that's the bigger part. And so that's probably the biggest mistake. It's the fact that a beginner player doesn't really have the abilities quite yet to reference like that. What I tell people, and the most important thing to do when you're a beginner player and you're using those numbers, is figure out what your arm speed is. And this is how you do it. You keep getting discs that are faster and faster and faster, and you see if they're doing what, or doing close to those numbers. Now, some molds are gonna be different. I'm not gonna lie to you. champ discs in the end of a line are almost always more overstable than the star line or the pro line, or certainly anything DX. You know, as we get lower and lower in the base, they honestly get even less stable than their numbers, if anything. But if you're like me, I've decided what my speed is. On a regular day, I'm 10.5. I like to say it's the same as my shoe size, which is crazy because I'm a tall guy. And on a good day, I'm an 11 speed, and on a good week, I can be a 12 speed person. But I will tell you, I can take a 7-speed eagle and throw it almost as far as a turn on a really good day, because it's the ability to overpower a disc, which will get you the distance. But anyway, those are the flight numbers. Comment below if you understood them to be different from somebody else. You can read articles. I made sure to read a couple before I even started this, because I of course had my ideas because I've been playing for a long time. But yeah, comment below, send me a message, ask me what discs that I know, because I play every day. I play leagues most every day and tournaments, and I film tournaments, and I spend a lot of time talking to people about discs. If you're interested in knowing a disc that's in the Discraft line, an MVP line, or Clash, or whatever it is that's out there, I probably can tell you what that's very similar to something else. And if you tell me, you know, about what you're throwing, you know, how far you're throwing with a particular disc, it's a pretty good judge. That's also something your friends can do. Get together with people that are better players than you. Put your pride away, because it's just going to be hard playing with the players that are doing everything right, or everything right in your mind, and just take the time to ask them the questions. But yes, that's flight numbers. Take it with you. Pay attention. That's what we got for today. And as always, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time. Like, subscribe, hit that funky bell. Bye.